There is a particular hush that settles over prairie towns in the hour before dawn, when the frost still clings silver to the fence rails and the only sound is the creak of a windmill turning somewhere in the dark, and it was in that hush, in the autumn of 1887, that a lawyer's clerk in Coldwater Junction, Kansas, told a ruined farmer named Elias Whitfield that the old stable behind the feed store was worthless, cursed, some said, unlucky at the very least, and certainly not worth the bother of tearing down. Elias had $11.40 to his name, a daughter of 8 years asleep in a wagon bed, and nowhere else in the world to put either of them. He paid $9 of those dollars for the stable that same afternoon, and the men who watched him do it shook their heads at the foolishness of a man buying a barn nobody wanted with money he could not spare. They did not know, and neither did he, that beneath the sagging porch boards of that forgotten building lay an iron-bound chest that had waited more than 20 years to be found, a chest that would not merely save one broken family, but would unravel a lie that had quietly strangled an entire county, and would set right a wrong that half the town had spent 2 decades trying to forget. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Elias Whitfield. If this kind of story, the kind where an ordinary person finds something the world overlooked, and it changes everything, is the kind of story you love, we invite you to stay with us to the end. Elias Whitfield had been raised in the rolling hill country of southern Ohio, in a household where nothing was ever thrown away until it had given every last measure of its usefulness. His father, a stonemason and sometime carpenter named Josiah Whitfield, had a saying that Elias carried with him his whole life, repeated so often in that low gravel voice that it had worn a groove into the boy's memory the way water wears a groove into limestone: waste is a judgment on the man who can't see what a thing is for. Josiah built root cellars that outlasted the houses above them, mended plows that other men had already condemned to the scrap pile, and taught his son that a piece of wood or a length of iron was never truly ruined, only waiting for someone patient enough to see past its wounds. Elias grew into a quiet, careful young man, broad through the shoulders from years of hauling stone, with hands that had learned early how to coax true joints out of warped lumber and how to read the grain of a board the way a preacher read scripture. He was not a man given to large words or large gestures. He measured his worth, and the worth of others, by whether a thing was done right, whether a promise was kept, whether a person showed up when they said they would. It was this steadiness that drew Martha Kessler to him at a barn raising in the spring of his 23rd year, when she watched him spend an entire afternoon patiently straightening bent nails that other men had simply tossed aside, because, as he told her without a trace of self-consciousness, a nail was still a nail. Martha was the daughter of a schoolteacher, sharp-tongued and clear-eyed, with a laugh that seemed to embarrass the sober Whitfield men around her and a stubborn belief that the Western Territories held a kind of promise that the crowded hill farms of Ohio could never match. They married within the year, and 4 years after that, with a toddling daughter named Clara riding on Elias's shoulders, they loaded a wagon and joined the slow river of families moving out onto the high plains of Kansas, chasing the Homestead Act's promise of 160 acres to any family willing to break the sod and prove up the claim. They settled some 11 miles outside a modest rail town called Coldwater Junction, on a stretch of land that Martha declared, the first time she saw it, was the most beautiful emptiness she had ever laid eyes on, grass to the horizon in every direction, broken only by the cottonwoods along a shallow creek, and a sky so wide it made a person feel, she said, both very small and very free at the same time. The early years were hard in the way that all homesteading was hard, but they were hard together, and that made a difference no ledger could measure. Elias built their soddy with his own 2 hands and later, as they could afford lumber freighted in from the east, a proper frame house with a porch Martha had asked for specifically because she wanted somewhere to sit in the evenings and watch the light change over the wheat. He learned to read the weather the way his father had read wood grain, learned which fields drained well and which held water too long, learned to mend his own harness and shoe his own horses rather than pay the smith in town more than he could spare. Clara grew up barefoot and sunburned and fiercely curious, following her father through the fields, asking him the names of every bird and insect until he ran out of names and began, half seriously, inventing new ones just to see her delighted disbelief. Martha kept the accounts, because she was quicker with figures than Elias ever claimed to be, and she kept, too, a small tin box of savings that she called their someday money, insisting that a family without a cushion was a family one bad season away from disaster. It was Martha who first spoke of Silas Vane's bank with a wariness that Elias, in those years, dismissed as her natural caution. The Vane Trust and Loan had come to Coldwater Junction not long after the railroad, and old-timers in town spoke of the elder Vane, a man named Corwin Vane, in tones that mixed respect for his wealth with something more guarded, something never quite said outright. By the time Elias and Martha arrived, Corwin had passed the bank to his son, Silas, a smooth, unhurried man who wore town suits even when he rode out to inspect properties, and who had a way of speaking to struggling farmers that made foreclosure sound almost like a kindness he was doing them. For 9 years, the Whitfield farm prospered modestly, weathering the ordinary disappointments of drought years and grasshopper years the way all their neighbors did, with grim humor and borrowed seed and the knowledge that next year's wheat might yet make up the difference. Then, in the autumn of 1885, Martha fell ill with a fever that the county doctor, arriving 2 days too late because of a swollen creek crossing, was unable to name with any certainty and unable, in any case, to cure. She died in the front room of the house she had built with him, in the bed beneath the window she had chosen because it caught the morning light, and Elias buried her on a low rise at the edge of their land where she had once said she would like to be laid, close enough to hear the wind in the cottonwoods. Clara was 7 years old, and for a long while afterward she did not speak much at all, and Elias found that his own voice, without Martha's to answer it, seemed to have gone strange and hollow in his own ears. Grief alone might have been a wound the man could have carried and, in time, might have begun to heal. But grief arrived that year alongside a drought the old-timers called the worst in a decade, 2 dry summers back-to-back that shriveled the wheat in the head and left the cattle bawling over cracked stock ponds, and Elias, distracted by mourning and stretched thin trying to be both father and mother to a silent little girl, fell behind on the note he had taken with Vane's bank 3 years earlier to buy a second plow and a stronger team. He was not alone in this. Half the farms along the creek were behind that year, and there was talk, quiet at first and then less quiet, that Silas Vane was not extending the patience his father once had. Elias rode into town in the spring of 1887 to ask for what every farmer in that position asked for, time, only time, until the next harvest could set things right, and Silas Vane received him in an office paneled in dark wood freighted in from St. Louis, listened with an expression of practiced sympathy, and explained, in the gentlest voice imaginable, that the bank's obligations to its own creditors simply did not allow for further delay. The foreclosure notice came within the month. Elias fought it the only way a man without money can fight anything, which is to say he pleaded, he offered labor in place of payment, he asked 3 neighboring farmers to vouch for his character before the county judge, and none of it moved the machinery that had already begun turning. In July, under a sky as merciless and blue as the one Martha had once called beautiful, the farm was sold at auction on the courthouse steps, and Elias Whitfield stood in the crowd and watched a man he did not know by his house, his barn, his fields, and the low rise where his wife was buried, for a sum that did not come close to what the land was worth, though it was more than enough to satisfy the bank. He was left, after the debt was settled, with a wagon, a team of tired horses, a trunk of clothes and tools, his daughter, and $41. It was not nothing. He told himself that, over and over, in the days that followed, the way a man repeats a thing he needs badly to believe. It was not nothing. But it was not enough to buy land, and it was not enough to rent a farm and stock it, and so Elias did the only thing that seemed to remain to him, which was to bring Clara into Coldwater Junction itself and look for whatever work a carpenter's hands could find in a town that had no particular need of another carpenter. They took a single room above the mercantile, paid for by the week, and Elias spent his days mending fences and porches and coffins for whoever would hire him, watching his savings shrink a little further with every rent payment, until, by the time autumn came around again, he had $11.40 and a growing, quiet fear that he would not be able to keep even that single room through the winter. It was in this state, hollowed by grief, chastened by loss, and running out of road, that Elias heard about the county's annual sale of abandoned and tax-delinquent properties, held on the courthouse steps on a cold October morning, the same steps, though he tried not to dwell on the irony, where his own farm had been auctioned away from him 3 months before. The clerk reading the list, a thin, nervous young man named Aldous Pratt, moved quickly through most of the parcels, an empty lot here, a collapsed smokehouse there, until he came to an entry that made him pause and glance up, almost apologetically, at the small crowd gathered against the cold. Lot 11, he read, the old co-stable, southeast corner of Grant and 3rd, together with a pertinent porch and outbuilding. Minimum bid, $5. A ripple of low laughter went through the men present, and someone near the back called out that Pratt might as well be selling the wind, because nobody in Coldwater Junction had wanted that stable in 20 years. Elias, standing near the edge of the crowd with Clara's mittened hand in his, asked the man beside him, quietly, why a building would sit unwanted for 2 decades in a town that could surely use another stable, and the man, an older farmer named Otis Renwick, whom Elias had come to know slightly through church, gave him a long, considering look before answering. Because of who built it, Otis said, and because of what happened to him. Old Ezekiel Coe built that stable with his own hands, best farrier this county ever had, freed man, came out here from Missouri right after the war looking to make something of himself. Ran that livery near 15 years, shod every horse from here to the county line. Then one winter he just, wasn't there anymore. Building sat empty ever since. Folks around here get funny about it. Say it's unlucky. Say old Ezekiel's still looking after it, in a manner of speaking, and don't take kindly to strangers. Otis said this last part with the faint smile of a man who did not fully believe the superstition himself but had lived long enough among people who did to respect its hold on them. Elias turned the word unlucky over in his mind and found that it did not frighten him nearly so much as the alternative, which was another week of rent he could not pay. When the bidding opened at $5 and nobody else raised a hand, he heard his own voice, rough with cold and something that was not quite hope, call out $9, if only to be sure no one else could snatch it away from him on a whim, and the gavel came down almost before the echo of his own words had faded. Pratt handed him the deed with an expression of mild bewilderment, as though he could not quite understand why any man would want it, and Otis Renwick clapped Elias once on the shoulder and said, not unkindly, well. Guess you'll find out for yourself now, what there is to find out. What Elias found, when he and Clara walked the 6 blocks to the southeast corner of Grant and 3rd and stood before their new property for the first time, was a long, low structure of gray, weathered lumber, its roofline sagging in the middle like the back of an old horse, its double doors hanging on rusted hinges, and a porch running along its front, for it had clearly served, in its day, as both stable and smithy and perhaps living quarters besides, with a small stove flue still visible at one end. Inside, the stalls stood empty and cobwebbed, the forge cold and choked with 2 decades of dust, and yet Elias, walking its length with the careful, assessing eye his father had taught him, felt something in his chest loosen slightly for the first time in months. The bones of the building were sound. Whoever Ezekiel Coe had been, he had built to last, the joints were tight, the beams true, the kind of workmanship that a man recognizes in another man's hands the way he'd recognize a familiar signature. We can live here, Elias told Clara, and for the first time in weeks she looked something other than sorrowful, gazing up at the high rafters with the frank curiosity that had once made her chase after every bird and beetle on their old farm. They set to work that same week, and it was on the 3rd day, while Elias knelt on the porch trying to determine why one section of flooring gave slightly under his weight where the rest held firm, that he found the first clue to what lay beneath. The give was not wrought, he realized, running his palm along the boards and feeling instead the faint outline of a seam that did not match the pattern of the porch's construction, a section perhaps 3 feet square that had been fitted, not nailed down in the ordinary way, but set into a frame so that it could be lifted, if a man knew where to press. He knew, because it was exactly the kind of joinery his father had shown him once in the floor of a Quaker meeting house back in Ohio, a hiding place built to look like nothing at all to anyone who did not already know its trick. Elias's pulse quickened in a way he had not felt since before Martha's death, and he pressed his thumb along the board's edge until, with a groan of stiff old wood, it lifted free. Beneath it, set into a shallow pit lined with flat creek stones to keep out the damp, sat an iron-bound chest, black with age but solid, its lock rusted shut but its wood, when he brushed away 20 years of dust and dirt, still sound beneath the grime. Elias sat back on his heels for a long moment, Clara pressed close against his side, both of them staring at the thing as though it might vanish if they looked away. It took him the better part of an hour, working with a chisel and a great deal of patient care, to break the ruined lock without damaging what lay inside, and when at last the lid creaked open, what greeted them was not gold, not at first, but paper, a thick sheaf of documents wrapped in oiled cloth to keep the damp at bay, and beneath the papers, a smaller cloth sack that clinked, when Elias lifted it, with the unmistakable weight of coin. He did not open the sack of coin first. Something in him, some instinct he could not have named, told him the papers mattered more, and so he unwrapped the oiled cloth with the same careful reverence his father had taught him to give any old and fragile thing, and found himself looking at a leather-bound ledger, its cover embossed with initials worn nearly smooth, E.C., and, tucked inside its front cover, a letter addressed, in a strong, careful hand, to whoever finds this, in better days than mine. Elias read the letter there on the porch floor, with the cold October light slanting through the open doors and Clara leaning against his shoulder to see the looping handwriting for herself, and what he read changed, in the space of perhaps 10 minutes, everything he thought he understood about the town he had come to live in. Ezekiel Coe, the letter explained, had been born enslaved in Missouri and had come to Kansas in 1866, a free man with nothing but his trade and his determination, and had built the stable with his own hands over the course of 2 years, shoeing horses and mending wagon wheels for anyone willing to pay him a fair wage regardless of the color of his hands. But Ezekiel's ambition, the letter revealed, had not stopped at his own prosperity. He had spent a decade quietly saving every spare dollar his trade could earn him, and had used those savings, together with a small inheritance from an uncle in St. Louis, to purchase, through a sympathetic land agent, in his own name, since the law permitted it even where custom did not always welcome it, 11 parcels of unclaimed prairie land to the north and west of Coldwater Junction, intending them as a foothold for other freedmen families who might come west seeking the same chance he had found. He had written to cousins and former neighbors back in Missouri and Tennessee, inviting them to come claim these parcels and build what he called, in the letter, a settlement where a man's worth is judged by his labor and not his skin, and he had held the deeds to those 11 parcels in trust, waiting for enough families to arrive to make the colony real, recording every transaction with meticulous care in the ledger Elias now held in his hands. But something had gone wrong, the letter continued, in language that grew more careful, more guarded, as though Ezekiel himself had feared who might one day read it. A local land agent, a man the letter named only as C.V., had learned of the parcels and had grown, in Ezekiel's words, most insistent that they be sold to him instead, offering sums far below their worth and growing angrier with each refusal. Ezekiel wrote that he had begun to fear for his safety, and had hidden both the ledger recording the 11 parcels and the small fortune he had saved, nearly $600 in gold coin, an almost unthinkable sum for a working man of that era, beneath his own porch, trusting that whatever happened to him, the truth would eventually surface. The letter ended, unfinished, mid-sentence, as though its author had been interrupted and had never returned to complete it. Elias sat for a long while after reading it, the ledger open across his knees, Clara silent beside him, both of them understanding without needing to say it aloud that they had stumbled onto something far larger than $9 worth of derelict property. He thought of Otis Renwick's words, that Ezekiel Coe had simply not been there one winter, that the building had sat empty ever since, and felt a cold and separate anger begin to kindle in him, distinct from his grief, distinct even from his own bitterness toward Vane's bank. He thought, too, of the initials C.V., and of Otis's earlier mention of old Corwin Vane, and though he told himself it might be coincidence, he did not truly believe it, not even in that first hour. Over the following days, working carefully by lamplight after Clara had gone to sleep, Elias pored over the ledger's careful entries and cross-referenced them, as best he could, against county land records he was permitted to examine at the courthouse under the pretext of researching his own new property. What he found confirmed his worst suspicion and then exceeded it. The 11 parcels Ezekiel Coe had purchased and recorded so meticulously in 1874 and 1875 did not appear, under his name, in the county's current records at all. Instead, The same 11 parcels, Elias checked the survey descriptions 3 times to be certain, were listed as having been acquired by Corwin Vane in 1876, the very year, by the ledger's own account, that Ezekiel Coe had vanished. The transfer record cited a bill of sale, supposedly signed by Coe himself, relinquishing all 11 parcels for a sum that, set against Ezekiel's own careful accounting of their worth, amounted to a fraction of their true value, and the signature on that bill of sale, when Elias compared it against Ezekiel's unmistakable, looping hand in the ledger and the unfinished letter, did not match at all. Elias brought his findings first not to the sheriff, whom he did not entirely trust, nor to Silas Vane, which would have been folly, but to Aldous Pratt, the young courthouse clerk who had read out the stable's sale that October morning and who, Elias had come to learn, kept his own private frustrations with the elder families who ran Coldwater Junction's affairs. Pratt examined the ledger and the forged bill of sale with growing unease, admitting quietly that he had always found something uncomfortable in the way the Vane family's landholdings had grown so quickly in the years after the war, though he had never had cause or evidence to question it aloud. Together, over several careful evenings, the two men began to trace what had actually become of the 11 parcels. Some had been sold off individually over the decades to other settlers, the profits presumably flowing into Vane coffers. 3. Elias discovered with a jolt that felt almost like recognition, lay within a few miles of his own former farm, land he had ridden past 100 times without knowing its history. And there was more still. Pratt, digging through old county death and disappearance records at Elias's urging, found a coroner's note from the winter of 1876, filed without much ceremony, recording the discovery of an unidentified man's body along the rail line some 8 miles east of town, a body that had never been formally claimed or named, buried at county expense in an unmarked grave in the potter's field behind the old cemetery. The dates aligned. The location aligned, roughly, with a route Ezekiel might plausibly have traveled if summoned, as the ledger's cautious final entry suggested he had once been, to a meeting he did not survive. Elias did not share every piece of this with the town at first. He understood, with the same careful instinct that had once told him to read the letter before opening the gold, that a man bringing an accusation against the most powerful family in Coldwater Junction would need more than suspicion. He would need proof laid out so plainly that even those inclined to look away could not manage it. And so, through that autumn and into the first hard frosts of winter, he and Pratt built their case with the patience of men laying a foundation, cross-checking every entry, every date, every land description, while Elias continued, by day, to repair the stable that was now, unmistakably, his and Clara's home, and to shoe the occasional horse for neighbors who had begun, cautiously, to trust the quiet man who had moved into Old Coe's place and not, as far as anyone could tell, come to any harm. For it. Word travels in a small town the way water finds the low ground, inevitably and without needing much encouragement, and it was not long before Silas Vane learned that the man who had bought the derelict stable at auction had also been seen at the courthouse several evenings running, closeted with young Pratt over old deed books. Vane came to the stable himself on a gray afternoon in November, driving a fine trap with a matched pair of bays, and found Elias mending a hinge on the smithy door with Clara nearby sorting nails into a tin can by size, a habit her mother had once taught her. Vane's manner was, as ever, smooth and unhurried, but there was a watchfulness in his eyes that had not been there during their earlier meeting in his office. He complimented Elias on the improvements to the property, remarked that he had not realized the old stable held any particular interest, and then, in a tone still pitched to sound like neighborly generosity, offered to buy the property back from Elias for $200, a sum so wildly disproportionate to what the building itself was worth that Elias understood at once, with a clarity that was almost bracing, exactly how much Vane feared what might be hidden inside it. Elias declined, as courteously as he could manage, and watched something flicker behind Vane's composed features, not quite anger, not yet, but the particular tightness of a man recalculating. Over the following weeks, the pressure took subtler forms. Two of the men who had begun bringing Elias smithy work suddenly found reasons to take their business elsewhere. The mercantile owner, from whom Elias had been buying lumber and nails on credit, informed him, apologetically, that he could no longer extend that credit, though he would not quite meet Elias's eye when he said it. Aldous Pratt, arriving at work one Monday, found a note from the county judge, a man widely known to sit on the same church board as Silas Vane, questioning certain irregularities in his recent handling of old land records, a warning plain enough that even Pratt's stubborn conscience wavered for a day or two. And one evening, walking home from the courthouse in the deepening dark, Elias himself was stopped by two men he did not recognize, rough-mannered strangers who suggested, in tones meant to sound almost friendly, that a man with a young daughter ought to think carefully about which old stories he chose to go digging up. It would have been easy, in the face of all this, for Elias to have let the matter rest, to have kept the gold coin quietly, said nothing of the ledger, and simply built a new life for himself and Clara in the stable his $9 had bought, telling himself that Ezekiel Coe's justice was not his responsibility to deliver. He turned this temptation over many times, alone, in the lamplit hours after Clara had fallen asleep, and found himself returning always to his father's old saying about waste being a judgment on the man who could not see what a thing was truly for. The gold, he came to understand, was not truly his to spend on comfort. It had been saved, coin by careful coin, for a purpose Ezekiel Coe had never gotten the chance to see through, and the ledger recording 11 stolen homesteads was not merely evidence of an old crime but a debt still owed to families who, as Pratt's research eventually uncovered, still existed, a granddaughter of one of Ezekiel's Missouri cousins, a woman named Rosetta Coe Ashby, now living with her own family in Nicodemus, one of the free black farming communities that had taken root some counties over, who had grown up hearing, third-hand and half-disbelieved, a family story about a relative who had gone west to build something and had simply vanished. Elias wrote to her that winter, care of the postmaster in her town, enclosing a careful copy of Ezekiel's letter and ledger entries, and her reply, when it came in January, arrived with a fierceness of hope in its handwriting that Elias found he could not set aside even had he wanted to. She had, she wrote, always believed there was more to her family's half-remembered story than the town of Coldwater Junction had ever admitted, and she asked, plainly, whether Elias intended to see the truth acknowledged, or whether he had written merely to satisfy his own curiosity before letting the matter drop as so many such matters were let drop. That letter settled something in Elias that all of Vane's pressure had not managed to unsettle. In February, with the ground still hard with frost, he and Pratt brought the ledger, the forged bill of sale, the coroner's note, and Rosetta Coe Ashby's own sworn statement, for she traveled to Coldwater Junction herself that winter, a journey of some 3 days by rail and wagon, arriving with a composure that Elias came to admire deeply in the weeks that followed, before the county court, in a public hearing that half the town crowded in to witness, drawn by rumor as much as by genuine interest in justice. Silas Vane arrived with his own lawyer and a confident bearing that did not survive the full airing of the evidence. The forged signature, examined by a handwriting expert brought in from the state capitol at the court's own expense, was declared inconsistent with Ezekiel Coe's verified hand in half a dozen surviving business records. The coroner's note, cross-referenced against Vane family correspondence that Pratt had, with some risk to himself, located in the county's own archived files, placed Corwin Vane in the vicinity of the unmarked grave within days of the body's discovery. It did not prove, conclusively, that Corwin Vane's hand had struck the blow that killed Ezekiel Coe, and the judge was careful, in his final ruling, to say so, but it proved beyond reasonable dispute that the elder Vane had forged the bill of sale, had seized 11 parcels of land that were never legally his, and had, for 20 years, profited from a fraud built on the disappearance of the man he had defrauded. Silas Vane, who had inherited both the fortune and, the court found, the legal liability that came with it, was ordered to restore the value of the misappropriated land to Ezekiel Coe's rightful heirs, a sum that, with 2 decades of accrued value, very nearly ruined the Vane trust and loan outright, and the bank's standing in the county, already dependent on a reputation for fair dealing that could not survive such a revelation, collapsed within the year, forcing Silas Vane to sell his own holdings and depart Coldwater Junction for parts unknown, a quiet exile that struck most who witnessed it as a fitting, if belated, echo of the erasure he and his father had once inflicted on a better man. The restitution, together with Ezekiel's own hidden savings, did not go to Elias, though the court, learning of his role and his evident honesty in bringing the matter forward rather than concealing the coin for his own use, offered him a modest finder's portion he initially tried to refuse. Rosetta Ashby insisted he accept it, telling him plainly that her great-uncle would have wanted the man who found his chest to be made whole by it, not impoverished by his own integrity. The larger sum, together with the 11 parcels themselves, recovered, where possible, from later purchasers at fair value, or left in the hands of families who had settled them in good faith and now paid a modest yearly sum into a trust instead, became the foundation of exactly what Ezekiel Coe had once envisioned, a settlement fund administered by Rosetta and a small board of trustees, offering land and modest starting capital to families, of any background, willing to homestead and build. In the country north and west of town. The stable itself, at Elias's own suggestion and with Rosetta's blessing, was restored properly that spring, its roof reset, its forge relit, and became once more a working smithy, but also, on Sunday afternoons, a gathering place where the old story of Ezekiel Coe was told and retold, not as a ghost story meant to frighten children away from an unlucky building, but as the true history of a man whose vision had finally, after 20 years, been allowed to stand. And so it was that the same stable which Aldous Pratt had once read aloud to a laughing, indifferent crowd as worthless, which the men of Coldwater Junction had shaken their heads over when Elias Whitfield spent his last $9 on it, became instead the axis around which an old injustice turned at last into something like restoration. Elias, who had arrived in that town with nothing but a wagon, a daughter, and a grief he did not know how to carry, found that the very act of seeing worth where others saw only waste, the lesson his father had planted in him so many years before, in a stonemason's yard in Ohio, had given him back not merely a livelihood but a purpose, and had given the ghost of a murdered man, at long last, the justice his own unfinished letter had trusted some stranger, someday, to deliver. Clara Whitfield grew up in that rebuilt stable watching her father shoe horses and mend wagons for families who now called the land beyond town not the Vane holdings but the Coe settlement, and she grew up, too, understanding in a way few children ever have cause to, that the things a careless world calls worthless are very often waiting only for someone patient enough, and honest enough, to look closer. If Elias Whitfield's story moved you today, we would be glad if you shared it with someone who might need reminding that value is not always visible at first glance, and that patience, honesty, and a willingness to look closer can uncover far more than any of us expect. We would love to know, in the comments below, what is a time you found real worth in something the world around you had already written off? We read every story you share with us. Until next time, stay close.